Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and smash the like icon if you want more content that challenges everything you thought you knew about our world. Your support helps us bring these incredible stories to light. Earth hasn't always belonged to us, and this isn't just a metaphor or poetic expression. This is a startling conclusion that scientists are beginning to reach when they finally stop being afraid of their own data and actually follow where it leads. Let me ask you something that might keep you up tonight. Our species, Homo sapiens, has been walking this planet for approximately 300,000 years. That sounds like an incredibly long time until you actually compare it to the age of Earth itself. Our planet is roughly 4.56 billion years old. To put this in perspective that your brain can actually grasp, if you compress the entire history of Earth into a single calendar year, humanity wouldn't appear until December 31st at 11:37 p.m. Think about that. We've been here for the last 23 minutes of the year, but before us, there was eternity. A dark, hot, living eternity that stretched on for billions of years. And within that vast expanse of time, there was more than enough opportunity for multiple civilizations to appear, flourish, build magnificent structures, develop advanced technologies, and then completely vanish without a trace. We're not talking about metaphorical or mythological civilizations here. We're talking about real, physical civilizations with technologies, architecture, and possibly ways of thinking that we can barely imagine. The real question isn't whether this could have happened. The real question is why we so stubbornly pretend it didn't. In 2018, an astrophysicist named Adam Frank and a climatologist from NASA named Gavin Schmidt published a research paper that flew almost completely under the radar of mainstream news. They asked one simple but absolutely devastating question. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth 50 or 100 million years ago, would we be able to find evidence of it today? They called this the Silurian hypothesis, and their answer was absolutely shocking. No, probably not. Over such vast periods of time, erosion, plate tectonics, volcanic activity, and biological processes destroy virtually everything. Buildings crumble to dust. Roads disintegrate. Metal structures corrode and break down. Polymers degrade. Everything becomes dust, dissolves into rock, and is lost forever. The only thing that might remain are chemical traces in geological layers, anomalous concentrations of isotopes, unusual ratios of elements, traces that we easily mistake for natural processes without even considering alternative explanations. Now here's where it gets really disturbing. We find these anomalies constantly, and every single time we explain them away as volcanic activity, meteorite impacts, or geochemical cycles, because the alternative explanation is just too uncomfortable to accept. But let's start from the beginning. Not with theories, but with facts, with things that actually exist, that you can touch, measure, and photograph, but that absolutely do not fit into the official history of Earth. Let me take you back to 1852 in Massachusetts, USA. Workers were quarrying rock at a depth of about 15 meters when they found something that shouldn't exist. The rock they were digging through dated to approximately 500 million years ago, Precambrian era, a time when, according to official science, there was nothing more complex than algae on land. And in this ancient rock, they found a metallic vessel, bell-shaped, decorated with silver inlay, featuring intricate floral patterns. The precision of its manufacture was so advanced that it would be difficult to reproduce even with modern tools. The Boston Transcript newspaper published this finding, but the scientific community chose to ignore it completely. The Dorchester vessel, as it came to be called, exists. Photographs of it exist, but explanations for how it got there do not exist. Or consider 1961, when amateur geologists in California cracked open a concretion, a geological formation estimated to be about 500,000 years old. Inside, they discovered something that was later identified as a spark plug. A metallic cylinder, a porcelain selate, tungsten wire spiral. This object became known as the Coso artifact. Skeptics say it's just an old spark plug from the 1920s that somehow got inside an iron concretion that formed quickly. Maybe. But other samples from the same region date significantly older, and nobody has ever published a definitive analysis that settles the matter. But these are just individual objects, single finds that you can explain away in different ways. Let's move to something bigger, something you can't accidentally drop in a quarry. Let's talk about geology itself. In South Africa, in the Klerksdorp region, miners have been finding strange objects since the 1930s inside Precambrian pyrophyllite. The rock is approximately 2.8 billion years old. These are metallic spheres, small ones, ranging from 2 to 10 centimeters in diameter. Some are perfectly polished. Some have 3 parallel grooves running exactly around their equator. Perfect, equally spaced, mechanically precise grooves. Geologist Rudds, curator of the Clarksdorp Museum who personally held hundreds of these objects in his hands, noted that their hardness and structure don't correspond to any known natural mineral formation. Official science calls them concretions of vivianite or pyrite, natural formations. But nobody has satisfactorily explained the parallel grooves around the equator, because nature doesn't make parallel grooves around equators. 2.8 billion years ago, Earth was a completely different planet. The atmosphere was predominantly methane. There was extremely little oxygen. Life existed only in the form of simple single-celled organisms. According to the official version, nothing more complex than cyanobacteria existed at that time. And yet, in rock from that time period, we find objects with mechanically precise geometric elements. Either we don't understand natural processes at all, or 2.8 billion years ago something was here, and that something was working with metal. But let's approach this from another angle. Forget about artifacts for a moment and look at living creatures. Octopuses. You've probably seen videos of octopuses on the internet. They open jars. They recognize individual human faces. They play. One octopus in a Seattle aquarium regularly escaped from its tank at night, crossed the room, ate fish from a neighboring aquarium, and returned back before anyone noticed. This isn't instinct. This is planning. This is anticipating consequences. This is covering your tracks. Octopuses solve problems that require multiple stages of planning. They use tools. They demonstrate individual personalities. Neurobiologist Peter Godfrey Smith, who wrote a book about octopus consciousness, says, "We look at these creatures and see intelligence that arose completely independently from our own. The last common ancestor between humans and octopuses lived about 600 million years ago. It was a flat, worm-like organism with no brain at all. Octopus intelligence and human intelligence evolved in parallel, independently from the same primitive starting point. This means one very important thing. Intelligence is not unique to our branch of evolution. It emerges again and again when conditions are favorable. This isn't a lucky accident. This is a pattern. Nature knows how to create thinking beings, and it does so at every available opportunity. Now apply this logic to paleontology. If intelligence emerges under favorable conditions, and if Earth had for billion years, and if there were several eras with favorable climate, stable ecosystems, and complex biological forms, why do we exclude the possibility that intelligence emerged before? Why are we so certain that we're the first? In 2017, Canadian paleontologists published research on fossils from the Novwojitic deposit in Quebec. The age of these samples, according to some estimates, ranges from 3.780 billion to 4.280 billion years. These are potentially the oldest traces of life ever discovered. And if this dating is correct, then life on Earth appeared almost immediately after the planet's formation. Literally in the first geological seconds after the surface cooled enough for water to exist. This turns upside down everything we thought about the complexity of life's emergence. If life appears instantly as soon as conditions allow, then it's not an exception, it's the rule. And 4 billion years is a very long time for that rule to work multiple times. Look at dinosaurs. They dominated the planet for about 165 million years. For comparison, modern mammals, including us, have existed for about 66 million years. Dinosaurs were on this planet 2.5 times longer than all mammals after their disappearance. And among them was a group that paleontologists long underestimated. Theropods, bipedal predators, which included Tyrannosaurus, Velociraptor, and many other species. Many of them had relatively large brains compared to their body size. Some demonstrated cooperative behavior. There were species with opposable fingers, which is critical for tool use. In 1982, Canadian paleontologist Dale Russell conducted a thought experiment that became famous. He took Stenonychosaurus inequalis, a small theropod with a large brain and 3-fingered hands, and tried to extrapolate what this creature would have become after another 64 million years of evolution if the asteroid hadn't ended the age of dinosaurs. He called the result the Dinosauroid, an upright creature with a large skull, hands with opposable fingers, binocular vision. Russell himself called this speculative, but the logic of evolutionary pressure was strict. Brains that work grow. Creatures that use tools gain advantages. These trends are universal. The asteroid hit 66 million years ago, but large-brain theropods existed long before that. They had more than 100 million years. More than 100 million years with neural architecture that showed signs of increasing complexity, with hands that could grasp objects, with social behavior that requires communication. Don't you think that, in 100 million years, something could have happened? Now let's talk about the traces that a civilization leaves behind, because this is where the Silurian hypothesis becomes truly terrifying. We produce enormous amounts of plastic. By some estimates, since 1950, humanity has produced more than 8 billion tons of plastic. About 6 billion tons of that has become waste. Plastic doesn't decompose quickly. Some types persist for hundreds of years. Geologists are already talking about the plastaglomerate, a new geological layer in which plastic particles are fused into rock. In 50 million years, our era will be noticeable in the geological record as a thin layer with anomalous content of synthetic polymers and altered carbon isotope composition. But here's the question. If we didn't know about humanity and just found this layer, would we understand it was a civilization? Or would we explain it as some unusual volcanic eruption? We know the answer. We would explain it as natural processes because it's simpler, because the alternative is uncomfortable. Because admitting that someone was here before us means rewriting everything we believe about our place in history. Now let's move to what geology tells us about mass extinctions, because this is where a truly dark question emerges. In Earth's history, there have been 5 mass extinctions where more than 75% of all species died. The most massive of these, the Permian extinction about 252 million years ago, destroyed about 96% of all marine species and about 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. The planet was essentially rebooted. The official causes are considered geological. Colossal volcanism in Siberia, sharp changes in atmospheric chemical composition, ocean acidification. But there's a nuance that geologists note quietly, almost in a whisper. The carbon isotope signal of the Permian extinction looks strange. The change in carbon isotope ratio happened too quickly for a purely volcanic explanation. In a 2021 paper, a group of researchers from China and the US showed that the isotope shift occurred within a few thousand years, which in geological terms is practically instant. This is too fast for slow volcanism, but it's exactly the pace that corresponds to large-scale burning of carbon-containing reserves. Something burned through enormous amounts of carbon very quickly. Natural processes, maybe, but if a technological civilization had exhausted its energy resources in a few thousand years and destabilized the climate, the isotopic trace would be exactly like this. We would be looking at our own end projected 250 million years ago and calling it a natural cataclysm. Now stop for a second because the next part changes everything. There's a concept that physicists call the anthropic principle. Briefly, it says this: an observer exists in a universe that allows observers to exist. We're here because conditions allowed us to be here. Simple logic, terrifyingly clear. Now apply the same logic to previous civilizations. If a technological civilization arose, say, 200 million years ago and lasted hundreds of thousands of years, used resources, altered the atmosphere, left traces, and then disappeared as a result of its own actions or an external catastrophe, what would we find? According to Frank and Schmidt's calculations, practically nothing except chemical anomalies in geological layers, which we find and ignore. But there's something else. Something that doesn't fit the standard picture at all, and that almost nobody talks about in the scientific press, though they do talk about it in conference hallways. Gold, platinum, iridium. These metals are called siderophilic, meaning iron-loving. They have enormous affinity for iron, and by all calculations should have sunk into Earth's liquid iron core 4 billion years ago when the planet was molten. Their surface concentration should be vanishingly small, but it isn't. On Earth's surface, there's about 1,000 times more gold, platinum, and platinum group metals than the model predicts. The standard explanation is called the late heavy bombardment. About 4 billion years ago, after the crust solidified, Earth underwent massive bombardment by meteorites that brought these metals to the surface. This explanation seems logical. Computer models support it. But there's a problem with distribution. If these metals were brought by random meteorite impacts, their distribution should be uneven, chaotic. Instead, we see concentrations that too often coincide with geologically active zones, with fault lines, with hydrothermal activity zones, as if something redistributed these resources after they arrived on the surface. This could be plate tectonics. This could be hydrothermal activity. But it could also be mining activity on scales we can't imagine. Mining moves metals, creates concentrations in processing locations, leaves traces in the form of disturbed element distribution. Our own mines do this. Our own metallurgical plants create local geochemical anomalies that will be noticeable for millions of years. Why do we exclude the possibility that something similar was done by others? Let's move to the ocean, because in the ocean there's something that makes biologists literally rewrite evolution textbooks. In 1977, the research vessel Alvin descended to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean near the Galapagos Islands. Depth, about 2,500 meters. Complete darkness. Pressure 250 times higher than atmospheric. Temperature a few degrees above zero. This should have been a desert, the most hostile conditions on the planet. And instead, scientists discovered an oasis. Around hydrothermal vents, life was teeming. Giant tube worms up to 2 meters long. Mollusks, crabs, fish, entire ecosystems, not one element of which depended on sunlight. Not one life form there engaged in photosynthesis. They used chemosynthesis, chemical energy from sulfur compounds emitted by hydrothermal vents. Before 1977, biologists were certain that all life on Earth depends on the sun, that this is a fundamental law of biology. Turned out to be false. Life found a fundamentally different path, existing completely independently from the surface world. And here's what's important. These hydrothermal ecosystems on the ocean floor have existed for billions of years. They survived all 5 mass extinctions. When the asteroid hit 66 million years ago and burned the Earth's surface, killing 75% of species, life around hydrothermal vents continued, unaware of the catastrophe above. They survived everything, every end of the world the planet has seen, and they continue to live today. If something complex had arisen in these ecosystems over billions of years of isolation, what are the chances we would know about it? We've explored less than 5% of the world's ocean floor. 95% remains a map with "Here be dragons" written on it. In 2023, a group of biologists published a description of a fundamentally new type of neural organization in deep-sea octopuses. They discovered that the nervous system of these animals is distributed in such a way that each tentacle essentially possesses autonomous intelligence. A tentacle makes decisions independently of the brain. This isn't an analogy or a metaphor. In a literal sense, an octopus has 9 brains, 1 central and 8 peripheral. And nobody knows exactly how they coordinate. This is a fundamentally different architecture of intelligence, unlike anything we've known. If such a radically different neural architecture arose in octopuses, what could have arisen over billions of years in complete isolation at the bottom of the ocean in creatures that never once encountered the surface world? And mainly, how would we even know about it? But let's return to the surface, to what we can see, to what has already been excavated, documented, but officially not explained. Turkey, 12,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe. This site was discovered by accident in 1963, and serious excavation didn't begin until 1995. What they found turned the entire chronology of human civilization upside down. Monumental stone pillars weighing 10 to 50 tons, T-shaped columns up to 6 meters high, decorated with complex carvings, animals, symbols, anthropomorphic figures, construction more massive and technically complex than Stonehenge, which is 7,000 years younger, and dates to the 12th millennium BC. This is a problem because according to official chronology, at that time people were hunter-gatherers, nomads. They didn't build monumental structures. They didn't have agriculture or cities or division of labor necessary for such construction. Archaeologists literally had to revise the concept. Now they say that Göbekli Tepe was built before the appearance of agriculture, and that agriculture possibly arose around it as a way to feed the workers. But this explanation leaves another question open. Who taught them? Where did the knowledge of architecture, labor organization, and engineering come from in a group of people who supposedly had just yesterday stopped sleeping under the open sky? Where did such complexity of thought come from instantly, without visible predecessors? Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who led the excavations until his death in 2014, said, "Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning. It's the end of something. It's the last monument of a civilization that was leaving. The last monument of a civilization that was leaving." Think about that. If he's right, then we found the final point, not the beginning. Where then is the beginning? What came before? And where did what came before disappear to? Now look at the geological context. Göbekli Tepe dates to approximately 12,000 years ago. This is exactly the time of the end of the last ice age. This is when global sea levels rose by about 120 meters. Huge coastal territories went underwater. Territories where people lived. If there was a civilization that existed in coastal zones over several millennia, it now lies on the seafloor under 100 meters of water. We find submerged ruins constantly. Off the coast of India in the Gulf of Kumbat, there are structures that, by some estimates, are 7,000 to 9,000 years old. They're underwater. Officially, this is acknowledged, but there's no detailed research because visibility in the Gulf is practically zero due to silt. Off the coast of Japan, there's the underwater Yonaguni complex. Official science debates whether it's a natural formation or artificial. The debate has gone on for 30 years without a final answer. We explore the land. The sea is almost inaccessible to us. And it's there, underwater, that the answers to questions that won't let us rest may lie. But now the most uncomfortable question of all. If something was here before us, if intelligent life already existed on this planet long before the appearance of Homo sapiens, where did it go and what exactly destroyed it? There are several options. The first and simplest is external catastrophe. Asteroid, massive volcanism, sharp climate change. Earth's history shows that such events repeat. No ecosystem is ensured. No civilization, no matter how developed, is protected from the impact of a 10-kilometer object. The second option is self-destruction. If intelligence arises under favorable conditions and technological progress is a consequence of intelligence, then dangerous technologies are also a consequence of progress. Nuclear weapons, biological agents, climate change. We ourselves are standing on this edge now. Why should a previous civilization have dealt with it better? The third option is merging with the planet. This sounds strange, but consider it. If a civilization developed for a long enough time and reached a sufficiently high technological level, it could have changed its nature so radically that it stopped leaving traces in the usual sense. Post-biological existence, consciousness transfer, symbiosis with the biosphere. This is speculation, but it's exactly this kind of speculation that serious researchers in the field of humanity's long-term future engage in. And there's a fourth option, the most uncomfortable one. They didn't disappear. They're here, just not where we're looking. Deep underground cave systems, the bottom of the world ocean, Antarctica under the ice sheet. These aren't metaphors. These are real zones inaccessible to systematic research. We know about the existence of microorganisms living in rock at depths of more than 3 kilometers. The so-called deep biosphere. The biomass of these organisms is comparable to the biomass of all surface life. An entire world we only learned about in recent decades. A world existing in complete isolation from the surface. What else is there? What lives in cave systems we haven't explored? In Antarctic subglacial lakes where water hasn't touched the surface for 15 million years? In oceanic abyssal zones where light hasn't penetrated since the beginning of time? We don't know. And this isn't a rhetorical device. We really don't know. Now let's talk about the next level of this problem. Because there aren't just anomalies in geology, there are anomalies in biology itself that suggest something more than standard evolution. Viruses. Standard biology describes viruses as primitive genetic parasites. They insert their code into the host's DNA and use the cellular apparatus to reproduce. This has been understood for a long time, but here's what was understood relatively recently. About 8% of the human genome consists of sequences of viral origin. Endogenous retroviruses that inserted themselves into our ancestors' DNA in the past and are now part of us. Some of them were preserved because they turned out to be functionally useful. The gene that ensures the formation of the mammalian placenta, syncytin, is of viral origin. Without viral insertion in our ancestors, we wouldn't have a placenta, we wouldn't have live birth in the form we know it. Viruses aren't just parasites. They're a mechanism of horizontal genetic information transfer. They copy code between species. They allow one organism to obtain a biological solution found by another. This is planned horizontal knowledge transfer, only in the language of DNA. If a sufficiently developed civilization understood this mechanics, it could use viruses as a tool, inserting information into the genomes of other species, preserving knowledge not in stone or books, but in biological code that would survive any catastrophe because it's distributed across billions of organisms. This sounds like science fiction, but the mechanics exist. Horizontal gene transfer is real. It's happening right now. We just don't understand everything that's inserted in us and why. In 2021, a group of researchers from several universities discovered sequences in the human genome that they called orphan genes. These are genes that have no analogs in any other species. They appeared in our genome out of nowhere. No predecessors, no homologs in other primates. They just exist. And some of them code for proteins whose function we don't understand. The standard explanation is that these genes arose from non-coding DNA regions as a result of mutations. De novo genes are biologically possible, but among them are genes that code for complex proteins with very specific structures. Complexity that random mutation would have to grope for over millions of years. And they appeared, according to evolutionary analysis data, relatively recently. What was inserted into us and who decided what exactly to insert? It sounds paranoid, but biology allows it, and we don't have a complete explanation for what we find. Now let's move to physics, to what happens to matter under extreme conditions, because here another layer of mystery opens up. There's a concept called panspermia, the idea that life or its precursors can spread through space inside meteorites and asteroids. In the Murchison meteorite that fell in Australia in 1969, amino acids were found, more than 90 types. Many of them are part of the proteins of all Earth organisms. Nucleotide bases, the building blocks of DNA and RNA, were also found in meteorites. This isn't controversial. This is a documented fact. This means that the chemistry of life is widespread in the universe, that the precursors of biology are synthesized in interstellar space and delivered to planets with stone bombardment. Life isn't invented from scratch on each planet. It's delivered ready-made components. But if life can travel between planets inside meteorites, then information can travel too. Not metaphorically, literally. Microorganism spores survive in the conditions of open space. Some bacteria demonstrate survival after being on the ISS for a year in unprotected conditions. If an impact object is large enough, it ejects fragments of rock from a planet's surface at low enough velocity that they aren't completely sterilized by heating. These fragments can reach another planet. We've found meteorites of Martian origin on Earth. This isn't theory. This is a documented fact. Mars and Earth exchanged rocky material. And if there was life on Mars in its wet era 3 to 4 billion years ago, that life could have reached Earth, or Earth life could have reached Mars. We could be one biosphere separated by space. But now Mars is dead. Its atmosphere is destroyed. The surface is sterilized by radiation. What destroyed Mars? The official answer is loss of the magnetic field that protected the atmosphere from solar wind. This happened about 4 billion years ago when Mars' core cooled and solidified, stopping the generation of a magnetic field. But there's another hypothesis much less discussed. Researcher John Brandenburg, a plasma physics specialist, analyzed the distribution of xenon-129 isotopes in Mars' atmosphere and concentrations of thorium and uranium on its surface. His conclusion, published in 2014, caused controversy. The data corresponds to the consequences of a large-scale nuclear explosion in the atmosphere, not natural radioactivity. Xenon-129 is a characteristic product of uranium fission. Its distribution in Mars' atmosphere is anomalous. Brandenburg suggested that ancient Mars could have been hit by nuclear weapons from space, either by someone external or as a result of internal conflict if there was a civilization there. This is a marginal theory. Most scientists reject it, but the isotopic data it's based on is real. And there are no other good explanations for the anomalous distribution of xenon-129 on Mars yet. If this is so, then we're looking at a dead planet that someone killed. And this planet is 30 light-seconds away from us. But let's return to Earth, because here too there are traces that aren't explained by standard history. And some of them are literally under our feet. Coal. We've been burning it for 200 years and think we know it well. Coal forms from organic material, predominantly plants, that accumulates in swamps and over time under pressure and temperature turns into rock. The age of coal seems we mine is 300 to 350 million years. This is the Carboniferous period. This is when there were giant forests on the planet, and then they died and became coal. And here's what's interesting. Objects are regularly found in coal. This is called coal artifacts. And the phenomenon is so widespread that it has a separate name in literature on paranormal phenomena, which itself is telling. because official science prefers to keep these finds precisely there, in the paranormal section, rather than considering them seriously. In 1912 in Oklahoma, a woman was breaking coal for her stove and found an iron pot inside a piece of coal. Documented. Coal from that region dates to about 320 million years. In 1892 in Illinois, a coin was discovered in a coal seam at a depth of about 30 meters, unlike any known currency, with incomprehensible symbols on both sides. Frank Kenley, the miner who found it, gave it to the local historical society. The coin existed. His further fate is unclear, but the strangest find dates to 1851. Again, Massachusetts. In a piece of coal, a metallic object was discovered resembling a tool for cutting fabric. Scissors of unusual construction, made from an alloy whose analysis at the time showed a composition uncharacteristic of natural rocks. Coal seam 300 million years. You can say it's contamination that objects got there later through cracks in the rock. This is the standard explanation, and sometimes it works. Iron objects really can migrate through rock under certain conditions, but not always and not for all these finds. Now let's look at something else. At traces left not by technology, but by biology. At traces that mean something large, something intelligent walked this land long before us. Footprints. Fossilized footprints are one of the main sources of information about prehistoric life, and they ask questions that make scientists nervously wince. In New Mexico in 1937, a fossilized footprint was discovered that very much resembles a human one, in rock from the Permian period, 275 million years ago. Researcher Alice Boer from the University of New Mexico studied it and stated that by all morphological characteristics, the footprint corresponds to a human foot. 5 toes, characteristic arch length about 30 centimeters. Official science explained it as a footprint of some reptile, deformed by erosion to an anthropomorphic form. Possible. But no Permian period reptile had a 5-toed foot with a characteristic arch. In Kazakhstan, in the Turkestan region, in 1983, Soviet geologists recorded a fossilized footprint that by all signs is a human footprint accompanied by a 3-toed dinosaur footprint. Both footprints in the same layer, dating about 150 million years. If a human and dinosaur walk side by side, this destroys the entire evolutionary chronology. Soviet scientists published this in regional geological publications. The West practically didn't notice this publication. In Texas, in the Glen Rose limestone along the Paluxy River in 1968, Stan Taylor documented dinosaur footprints and among them found something that looked like human footprints in the same rock. Age about 130 million years. This became the subject of enormous discussion. Skeptics subsequently claimed these were degraded dinosaur footprints where toes weren't imprinted. Maybe, but some footprints have a distinct big toe diverted to the side, which is characteristic of primates but not dinosaurs. Nobody can say definitively, because definitive research would mean admitting or refuting what official science prefers to keep in the impossible category. But there's one more story that happened quite recently and is difficult to explain simply as researcher errors. Schöningen, Germany, 1993. During construction work, workers came across an unusual find in deposits dated to approximately 25,000 years ago. A small object made of mammoth bone. It depicted a figurine of a human with a lion's head. They called it Lowenmensch, Lion Man. Turned out not to be unique. Similar artifacts were found throughout southern Germany in the Swabian Alps. They're from 28,000 to 40,000 years old. This is the oldest known sculpture in the world, created by Homo sapiens in a period when, according to the official version, people were just beginning to decorate caves with simple contour drawings. And suddenly out of nowhere appears a complex three-dimensional sculpture with a conceptually complex image of a hybrid creature that doesn't exist in nature. To create the image of a non-existent hybrid requires abstract thinking. For sculpture requires tools. For tools requires bone-working technology. All this appeared simultaneously, suddenly, without visible predecessors. Anthropologists call this the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. About 50,000 years ago, something happened to the human brain. Suddenly, without obvious genetic changes, people began making jewelry, musical instruments, complex weapons, ritual burials, art. The entire spectrum of cognitive abilities that we consider defining for modern humans appeared practically simultaneously, as if someone turned on a switch. What was it? Genetic mutation, climate change that created selection pressure, or contact with something that transmitted knowledge? We don't know. Official anthropology talks about genetic mutation and cultural diffusion. This is a reasonable explanation, but it doesn't explain the speed of changes. Evolution is slow. Cultural diffusion requires contact between groups. And 50,000 years ago, human populations were scattered over huge territories with minimal contact. Let's move to what I call the terra nullius problem. This is a legal term meaning nobody's land. When Europeans arrived in Australia, they declared the continent terra nullius, although Aborigines lived there. Aborigines simply weren't counted as people who could have history and rights. We do the same with prehistoric past. We look at the planet and see terra nullius, an empty place that was inhabited only by us. This is a convenient fiction, but it's fiction. Australian Aborigines have an oral tradition that, according to recent research, preserves reliable memories of events from 7 to 20,000 years ago, in particular about changes in coastlines and flooding of coastal territories after the end of the Ice Age. This was verified by geological data. Oral tradition preserved geologically accurate information for more than 10,000 years. If human memory can preserve accurate information for 10,000 years through oral tradition, then myths and legends about gods, creators, teachers who came from outside maybe aren't just stories. Maybe they're degraded, mythologized, but fundamentally factual memory of real events. In practically all ancient cultures of the world, there's the same motif. More developed beings come. They teach people agriculture, astronomy, construction, medicine. Then they leave or disappear, sometimes promising to return. In Sumer, these are the Anunnaki who came from the heavens. In Egyptian tradition, these are the Neteru, gods of the first time, Zep-Tepi, who established the order of the world before the pharaohs. In Mesoamerican traditions, these are feathered serpents, Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, who brought civilization and promised to return. In Indian texts, these are Devas, beings who flew on vimanas and fought with weapons whose destructive power is described in terms extremely reminiscent of nuclear weapons. We could say this is just mythology, an attempt by a primitive mind to explain incomprehensible phenomena through anthropomorphic images. And this is certainly true for part of mythology, but not for all of it, because Sumerian mythology contains precise astronomical data. The Sumerians knew about Neptune and Uranus. These are planets invisible to the naked eye. Officially, they were discovered in the 18th and 19th centuries, respectively. How did the Sumerians know about them 4,000 years before the invention of the telescope? The Maya created a calendar whose accuracy in describing the length of the solar year exceeds the Julian calendar used in Europe until the 16th century. Their astronomical tables predicted solar and lunar eclipses with accuracy that modern astronomers reproduce only with computers. Where did such accuracy come from in a civilization that had no metal tools and used obsidian knives? Egyptians recorded in the Westcar papyrus texts and pyramid texts concepts that echo modern physics so precisely that some researchers, including physicist John West and geologist Robert Schoch, claim Egyptian theology is encrypted physics, not metaphor but code. Ra isn't just a sun god, it's a model of the electromagnetic field. Ka and Ba aren't just soul, they're concepts of quantum entanglement and information duplication. This is speculation, certainly, but it's based on texts that exist, that date to 5,000 years ago, and that contain ideas fundamentally incomprehensible without a certain level of physics education. Who composed these texts and where did they get these ideas? Now let's return to geology, to what the planet preserved not in texts, but in stone. Fossilized flora in Antarctica, tropical fossils in Siberia. All this testifies that Earth's climate zones were historically completely different. There were periods when the entire planet was covered with ice. This is called snowball Earth. And periods when even polar regions were tropics. These climate fluctuations were extreme, and every time the climate changed sharply, most species died out, but some survived. In every mass extinction, a small percentage of species survived the catastrophe. Sometimes this is explained by ecological niche, sometimes by geographical luck. But sometimes survival is inexplicable. In the Permian extinction, almost all marine species died, but archaea, simple microorganisms, survived practically without losses. Moreover, they thrived in conditions that killed everything else. High temperature, acidified ocean, low oxygen content. For archaea, this was a resort. Archaea are possibly the oldest living organisms on the planet. They're about 3.5 billion years old. They survived everything, every end of the world. And now they live everywhere. In Yellowstone's boiling springs, in the Dead Sea, in the human gastrointestinal tract, in rock at 5 kilometers depth. They're practically immortal by biological standards. They adapt to any conditions. They're metabolically unique, and they resemble nothing. Archaea differ so much from bacteria and eukaryotes that they were allocated to a separate domain of life only in 1978. Before that, they were simply considered strange bacteria. Carl Woese, the microbiologist who introduced this division based on ribosomal RNA analysis, was shocked. He said, "They're so different they seem like creatures from another planet. Was this a joke or not?" In 2018, a group of Japanese researchers extracted archaea from marine sediments about 100 million years old. The organisms were alive, just in a state of extremely slowed metabolism. They didn't divide and didn't die for 100 million years. They just existed, waiting. What were they waiting for? This is anthropomorphism. Of course, they weren't waiting for anything in the sense we put into that word. But from an information standpoint, these organisms contain genetic code that's 100 million years old. Code that works, that remembers what to do. If a more complex organism could enter a similar state, it could survive any catastrophe. And when conditions became favorable again, emerge from it. Tardigrades, microscopic animals also called water bears. They can enter a state of cryptobiosis, practically completely stopping metabolism. In this state, they survive at temperatures close to absolute zero, when heated to 150 degrees Celsius, in open space without any protection, under pressure 6 times exceeding the pressure in the deepest ocean trenches, and under radiation doses thousands of times exceeding the lethal dose for humans. This isn't science fiction. This is a documented biological fact. Tardigrades were sent into open space as part of the Photon M3 experiment in 2007. Some of them survived, returned to Earth, exited cryptobiosis, and began reproducing. If tardigrades can survive open space, then the principle of cryptobiosis isn't a unique adaptation to Earth conditions. This is a universal biological survival mechanism, and evolution finds this mechanism because it works. Now let's apply this to the big question. If a being with sufficiently complex biology had the ability to cryptobiosis, it could survive mass extinction, go into the Earth, into ice, into the deep ocean, wait. And when the planet recovered, emerge. And if this being was intelligent, it would remember everything that was before the catastrophe, all accumulated experience, all history. This would explain some of what we talked about earlier. The appearance of complex knowledge in early human civilizations, astronomical data they shouldn't have had, construction technologies that outstrip available tools, myths about teachers who came from underground, from water, from the heavens. These teachers might not have been aliens from other planets. They could have been from here. They could have been millions of years older than us. They could have looked at us with the patience of beings for whom several thousand years isn't a period. But let's talk about evidence, not about possibility, but about what we can present. Because any good theory should make predictions that can be tested. If a technological civilization existed before us, we should find isotopic anomalies in geological layers. We find them. The Permian-Triassic extinction has a carbon isotope signal that isn't fully explained by volcanism. If intelligent life was on the planet long enough, it should have left a trace in the biology of other species through horizontal gene transfer. We find orphan genes in the human genome whose origin is unclear. If a past civilization used resources, there should be disruption of metal distribution, anomalous concentration of siderophile elements on the surface that's higher than expected. We find this too, although the official explanation of late bombardment is a competing hypothesis. If something survived and continues to exist hidden, we should see traces of presence in hard-to-reach zones, anomalies in deep-sea regions, incomprehensible acoustic signals from the depths, strange animal behavior near certain geological structures. And here we move to a phenomenon that's officially documented but explained extremely unsatisfactorily. The bloop. In 1997, NOAA's hydrophone network, designed to monitor underwater earthquakes and nuclear tests, recorded an exceptionally powerful sound. It was heard by stations more than 5,000 kilometers apart. In power, it corresponded to the loudest biological sounds ever recorded, but was significantly more powerful than anything known in the animal world. Its source was determined to be the southern Pacific Ocean region. Initially, it was suggested this might be the sound of an unknown large marine creature. Then in 2012, NOAA officially explained the bloop as the sound of an iceberg breaking, a specific type of acoustic event called icequake. But the acoustic characteristics of the original recording differ from the icequake profile. Some researchers who studied the original file claim that the waveform has signs of biological origin. In 2014, a Finnish group of researchers published an analysis showing that several unexplained acoustic anomalies recorded by hydrophone networks in different years have frequency characteristics that don't correspond to either known biological sources or geological processes. The article passed practically unnoticed. We hear something from the depths. We don't know what it is, and we officially stopped talking about it. Now let's talk about the most uncomfortable aspect of this whole topic, about why we so persistently don't want to consider this possibility. There's a psychological phenomenon called hyperbolic discounting. This means we give disproportionately large importance to the near future and underestimate distant consequences. Applied to this topic, it looks like this. Admitting that there was a civilization before us immediately creates a whole range of uncomfortable questions. Questions we don't have answers to. And science doesn't really like questions it doesn't have answers to, as opposed to questions it has complex answers to. First, it undermines confidence in the system. Second, it strengthens it. Therefore, anomalies are ignored. This isn't a conspiracy. This is psychology. This is how academic institutions work. An anomaly that can't be explained within the existing paradigm is easier to set aside than to review the entire paradigm. Thomas Kuhn described this in his concept of scientific revolutions. He showed that normal science works exactly like this. It accumulates anomalies until their weight becomes unbearable, and then a revolution happens. But this process takes generations. The problem is that for some questions, we might not have several generations to think because they concern our own future. If there was a civilization before us and it disappeared, it's critically important for us to understand how and why. Not out of academic curiosity, but out of pragmatic instinct for self-preservation. Because if it disappeared due to climate change, that's a warning for us. If due to war using weapons of mass destruction, that's also a warning. If due to contact with something external, that's a warning of another kind. History is always a textbook, but only if you read it. And now we move to what I consider the most important conclusion from all of the above. We're used to thinking of ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution, as the endpoint of a long path from simple organisms to complex thinking beings. We look back and see progress. Single-celled, multicellular, fish, reptiles, mammals, primates, humans. A linear path upward. But evolution isn't linear. Evolution is a network. It's a tree with thousands of branches, most of which end in dead ends. 300,000 species of beetles exist right now. We exist in the singular. This isn't because we're better than beetles. This is because we got lucky. Our branch of the tree hasn't ended in catastrophe for the last 300,000 years, but other branches have ended many times, and some of those branches were smart. Understanding that intelligence isn't a unique achievement of our line, that it arises under favorable conditions and can arise again and again, changes how we see our place in history. We're not the first. We might not be the last. We're just the current residents of a planet that has seen much before us and will see much after us. This should cause not fear, but humility and curiosity. Because if someone was here before us and left traces, we haven't found them all yet. Most of the planet is unexplored. The ocean floor, deep cave systems, Antarctic subglacial lakes. This is terra incognita, literally unknown land. On our maps, only a small part of the planet says explored. And with each new tool, with each new research method, we find something that shouldn't be there. An anomaly, a discrepancy, a thing that violates what we thought we knew. In 2023, a group of researchers from MIT developed a new DNA analysis method that allows detecting sequences of very ancient origin with much greater accuracy than before. One of the first results of applying this method to the human genome showed the presence of sequences that evolutionary analysis dates significantly older than the appearance of Homo sapiens. The article was published in preliminary format and hasn't yet passed full peer review, but the methodology is described in detail. What does this mean? Maybe nothing special. Horizontal gene transfer happens constantly. Ancient sequences can be the legacy of viral insertions from our primitive ancestors. But maybe it means there's something in us that was recorded long before us. Something that survived catastrophe, that traveled through time in biological code, that waited, that we don't yet know how to read. We look into Earth's past and see emptiness. But emptiness isn't the absence of content. It's the absence of our attention. We didn't look for traces because we were sure there weren't any. We didn't ask the question because we were afraid of the answer. But the question has already been asked. By geology itself, by biology itself, by physics itself. They ask it every time we find something that doesn't fit, every time an anomaly turns out to be too persistent to ignore. Who was here before us? And the answer that's beginning to emerge through all the knowledge we've accumulated isn't mystical and isn't religious. It's biological, geological, chemical. The answer says this: life on this planet is significantly older and significantly more diverse than we thought. Intelligence arises under favorable conditions and has arisen more than once. And traces of past intelligent presence we're already finding. We just don't call them what they perhaps are. This requires courage, intellectual courage, to admit that Earth's history doesn't begin with us, that we're not the pinnacle but just another chapter in a very long book, and that previous chapters were perhaps written in a language we're only beginning to decipher. Decipher. This is exactly the key word here, because the language these traces are written in isn't alphabetic and isn't digital. It's the language of molecules, isotopes, frequencies, geometry, and we're only now creating tools capable of reading it. In 1968, geochemist Claire Patterson made a discovery that at first seemed like a technical detail. He developed a method for precise measurement of lead isotope composition in ancient rocks and applied it to date Earth's age. His result of 4.550 billion years remains relevant to this day. But in the course of his work, he discovered something unexpected. In modern samples, there was catastrophically more lead compared to ancient rocks. So much more that it couldn't be explained by natural geological processes. This was lead of anthropogenic origin, a consequence of human industrial activity. Patterson literally saw the chemical signature of human civilization in the geological record. He understood that we leave a trace, clear, measurable, unique, a trace that in a million years some other intelligence could read in stone and say, a civilization was here. This is when it appeared. This is how quickly it changed the planet's geochemistry. And here arises the reverse question. If we can read our own trace in geology, can we read someone else's? Patterson showed that industrial activity leaves specific isotopic patterns. These patterns are unique. They differ from volcanic emissions, from meteorite impacts, from any natural processes. They have a chemical signature. So we need to look for this signature in prehistoric layers, systematically with modern tools without prejudice. Nobody has done this purposefully. Individual anomalies were found, individual researchers published them. But there's no systematic program to search for chemical signatures of potentially artificial origin in Precambrian and Paleozoic deposits. No major scientific organization has funded such work, because the hypothesis it would test is considered unscientific. This is a logical circle. The hypothesis is unscientific because it hasn't been tested. It hasn't been tested because it's unscientific. Science doesn't work like this in theory, but in practice, this is exactly how it works when it comes to things that too strongly violate consensus. But there's a group of people who are still searching. Not academic institutions, no. Independent researchers, amateur geologists, retired chemists. And sometimes they find something that deserves attention. In 2017, an independent researcher from Poland published in an obscure geological journal the results of analyzing samples from several coal seams. He used a modern mass spectrometer and looked for isotopic anomalies that might indicate technological origin. In 3 samples, he found an unusual ratio of osmium isotopes. Osmium is a very rare platinum group metal. Its isotope ratio in natural samples varies predictably depending on geological age and rock type. In his samples, the ratio didn't correspond to any known natural pattern. It resembled the isotopic profile of osmium after high-temperature industrial processing. The publication caused zero resonance in the academic world. No refutation, no confirmation, just silence. This is worse than criticism. Silence means nobody even considered it necessary to check. Now let's talk about what's happening in biology right now. About finds that destroy our understanding of what's possible in living nature, and that indirectly indicate how little we know about its history. In 2021, the journal Science published work by a group of researchers from several universities led by Karen Lloyd. They studied microorganisms discovered in marine sediments at depths from several hundred meters to several kilometers below the ocean floor. The age of deposits ranged from several million to 100 million years. And in these deposits, they found living organisms. Not spores, not dormant forms, but metabolically active, albeit extremely slow, living cells. When researchers added nutrients to these organisms, some of them began to divide. They divided slowly, very slowly, about once every 10,000 years. But they divided. They were alive, and some of them apparently had lived in that rock since the rock formed. 100 million years. 100 million years of continuous existence without sun, without oxygen, feeding on chemical energy from minerals in complete darkness, under enormous pressure, at temperatures close to zero. Lloyd said in an interview after publication, "We're looking at life that lives in an absolutely different dimension of time. For them, a million years is about the same as 1 year is for us. They don't see evolution. They're too slow for evolution in the usual sense, but they're stable. Stability. This is the key word. If a more complex organism achieved such stability, it could survive any catastrophe without changing. Enter the rock, the ice, deep into the earth, and just wait millions of years until conditions become favorable again. This isn't fantasy. This is a principle that biology already demonstrates, just at the microorganism level. The question is how far this principle scales. And now let's move to what's happening right now. Not in the past, today. Because there's data collected in recent years that fits into this picture in such a way that ignoring it is becoming increasingly difficult. In 2014, biologist Rupert Sheldrake from Cambridge published an analysis of data on migratory bird behavior. He discovered a statistically significant anomaly. Some flocks of birds during migration use routes that aren't explained by magnetic navigation, or orientation by stars, or visual landmarks. They seem to know something about the landscape that they shouldn't know. They pass through territories that were changed by humans after the given population began using this route. But the route doesn't change. They continue to fly where there used to be a swamp, and now there's an airport. Sheldrake proposed the concept of morphic resonance, the idea that biological systems possess collective memory extending beyond genetics. This concept remains extremely controversial and is mainly rejected by official science. But the problem it tries to solve, the behavior of birds, is real, and standard neurobiology doesn't explain it. If there's a mechanism of information transfer between organisms or generations extending beyond genetics and direct learning, this changes our entire understanding of how living systems preserve information about the past. But let's leave the speculative, return to the solid, to what's measurable and reproducible. Quantum biology is a relatively new field of science studying quantum effects in biological systems. Until recently, it was believed that quantum phenomena were too delicate for the warm, wet, chaotic environment of a living cell. Quantum superposition and entanglement require isolation from the environment and very low temperatures. Living cells are warm, wet, and full of random molecular collisions. Quantum effects should immediately be destroyed. But in 2007, a group led by Gregory Engel from the California Institute of Technology discovered quantum coherence in chlorophyll molecules during photosynthesis. Living plants use quantum superposition to simultaneously explore several energy transfer paths and choose the most efficient one. Quantum computing in a living cell at room temperature in the most ordinary blade of grass. Then quantum effects were discovered in enzymes, in birds responsible for orientation by magnetic field, in olfactory receptors, in DNA mutation mechanisms. Everywhere science looked closely enough, it found quantum processes at the base of key biological functions. This means life doesn't just use chemistry. Life uses quantum physics. And if this is so, then the potential capabilities of biological systems are significantly wider than we thought. Quantum coherence allows processing information in a fundamentally different way than classical systems. In parallel, not sequentially. Optimally, not approximately. If a sufficiently complex living organism uses quantum computing in its nervous system, its cognitive capabilities could be incomparably higher than human ones. Not quantitatively more, not several times smarter, but qualitatively different. Just as a quantum computer isn't just faster than a classical one, it solves classes of problems for which a classical computer is fundamentally unsuitable. What if a being with a quantum coherent nervous system, having lived millions of years, looks at us approximately as we look at ants? Not with contempt, just with that level of difference that makes direct interaction practically impossible. We see an ant carrying a breadcrumb. The ant doesn't see us, not because we're invisible, just because its sensory system and cognitive apparatus aren't capable of processing information about us as a connected whole. If this analogy is accurate, then looking for traces of this being in the form of artifacts, structures, writing is meaningless. This is like an ant looking for traces of humans in the form of anthills. A being of this level leaves traces in a language we're barely beginning to learn. The language of isotopes, frequencies, quantum patterns, geochemical anomalies. And we've already found some of these traces, we just don't know how to read them. Here I want to pause and say something important. Everything we're talking about is hypotheses of varying degrees of validity. Some of them, like the Silurian hypothesis, are published in peer-reviewed scientific journals and are based on strict methodology. Others, like the interpretation of isotopic anomalies as traces of civilization, are speculative constructions that can't yet be tested. The difference between these two categories is important, but what's also important is that the boundary between them isn't final. 100 years ago, the idea that continents move was a marginal theory that authoritative geologists laughed at. Today, plate tectonics is the foundation of geology. 50 years ago, the idea that bacteria cause stomach ulcers was rejected by the academic community. Barry Marshall, who proposed this hypothesis, was forced to drink a glass with Helicobacter pylori culture to prove his point. He later received the Nobel Prize. Marginal theory and wrong theory aren't the same thing. Academic rejection and refutation also aren't the same thing. And in this case, we don't have refutation. We have silence and ignoring, which is itself informative. Now let's move to what's happening right now on the cutting edge of the search, to real expeditions, real research programs that, without calling things by their names, are doing exactly what we're talking about. NASA's Biosignature Search Program on Mars. Officially, this is a search for traces of life. The Perseverance rover collects samples of Martian rock and examines them for organic molecules and other biomarkers. The official formulation is a search for simple microbial life forms that may have existed billions of years ago. But the methodology they're applying is exactly what the Silurian hypothesis talks about applied to Earth. Searching for chemical traces in geological deposits. And if they find something that doesn't fit standard abiotic chemical processes, they call it a potential biosignature. Nobody's saying yet these are traces of civilization, but the methodology allows detecting them if there's anything to detect. And interestingly, some of Perseverance's results haven't been officially published yet. Some data is undergoing extended analysis. Publication deadlines have been postponed several times. This could be the normal course of science. Thoroughness takes time, but it could also be something else. In parallel, there's the NASA Astrobiology Institute program, which funds research, including those directly related to the Silurian hypothesis. In 2020, as part of this program, work was funded to search for technosignatures, that is, traces of technological activity in Earth's geological record. This is an official scientific program, funded by NASA, searching for traces of technology in Earth's geology. Results haven't been published yet. The China National Space Administration in 2023 launched a program to study Antarctic subglacial lakes. Officially, studying extreme environment ecosystems. Unofficially, according to some data from program participants, searching for chemical anomalies in lake sediments. The program is classified at the details level. General parameters are known, specific data are not. Lake Vostok in Antarctica. We've already mentioned it, but there are details worth examining in more detail. When Russian scientists in 2012 finally drilled through the ice and took the first water samples, DNA analysis showed something unexpected. Sequences of DNA were discovered in the water that don't match any known organism. Not similar to bacteria or archaea or eukaryotes. About 3% of all DNA in the samples was completely unidentifiable. The official interpretation is contamination of samples during drilling, because drilling fluid can contain microorganisms. Possible. But 3% is a lot for contamination, and the form of these sequences doesn't correspond to typical contaminants. The second interpretation, more cautious, is that DNA degraded so much over millions of years of isolation that it's not subject to identification. Also possible. But in that case, it should have degraded so much that it shouldn't have been possible to detect it at all as connected sequences. The third interpretation hasn't been officially proposed by anyone. This is DNA from organisms that evolved in complete isolation long enough to become fundamentally different from everything we know. The Russian group requested funding for redrilling with improved sterilization protocols. Funding was cut, the program was frozen. The topic is practically not discussed in the academic world, but the lake hasn't gone anywhere. And whatever is there, it continues to exist in darkness under 4 kilometers of ice, in isolation that's lasted about 15 million years. 15 million years of isolation. In this time, human and chimpanzee lines diverged from our common ancestor. In this time, new species arose. Entire ecosystems appeared and disappeared. And there, under the ice, something lived, unaware of all this. Now let's move to the aspect that seems to me the most intellectually honest in this conversation, to the limits of our knowledge. Karl Popper, one of the most influential philosophers of science of the 20th century, argued that a scientific theory should be falsifiable, that is, there should be a possibility to conduct an experiment or make an observation that could refute the theory. Without this criterion, the theory isn't scientific according to Popper. Let's apply this criterion to our question. Hypothesis. A technological civilization existed on Earth before humanity. How to refute it? You need to prove that not one of the geochemical, biological, or geological anomalies can be interpreted as a trace of technological activity. For this, you need to systematically investigate these anomalies, which, as we've already said, nobody is doing purposefully. So the hypothesis at the moment is neither confirmed nor refuted. It's in a suspended state not because the data says no, but because nobody conducted a systematic check. This is a scientifically unsatisfactory state, and it persists not due to lack of technical ability to test the hypothesis. Modern tools allow it. It persists due to lack of will, academic will to ask a question that violates consensus. But sometimes consensus is broken by events that can't be ignored. In September 2023, Mexican researcher Jamie Mawson presented to the Mexican Congress what he called mummified bodies of non-human beings discovered in Peru. 2 small bodies with 3-fingered hands, large heads, and atypical anatomy. Mawson stated that carbon analysis dates their age to about 1,000 years and that DNA analysis showed belonging to an unknown species. The academic community reacted skeptically. A number of anthropologists pointed out that similar deformed mummies in Peru are known as artifacts of ritual practices. Children whose skulls were deformed during life, whose bones could have been artificially assembled. DNA analysis conducted by independent laboratories later showed mixing of DNA from different people, which is typical for composite artifacts. The story received enormous resonance and quieted down just as quickly as many similar stories before it. But here's what's important. The very fact that such an event happened, that it was shown in a country's national parliament, that world press wrote about it for several days, says something. It says that the request for an answer is very large, that people want to know, that the question is alive and isn't going anywhere. No matter how much it's closed, people feel that something isn't right, that the official picture isn't complete, that beyond the horizon of the official narrative there's something they aren't being told. And this feeling isn't irrational. It's based on real discrepancies that we've examined in detail. Official Earth history is a magnificent, detailed, mostly accurate picture, but it has gaps, and these gaps aren't random, they're systematic. They appear everywhere where the question concerns the possibility of intelligent life before humans. Everywhere where data could point in an uncomfortable direction. This isn't a conspiracy. Conspiracy implies coordinated actions. Here we're talking about cognitive bias built into the very structure of academic science, about how funding, publication, and researcher career growth work. Ask an uncomfortable question, and you're a marginal. Get an uncomfortable result, and you have publication problems. Publish an uncomfortable article, and you'll lose funding for the next grant. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is sociology of science. This is a well-documented phenomenon described by Kuhn, Feyerabend, and many others. But the knowledge mechanism itself doesn't determine truth. Truth is determined by data, and data continue to accumulate. In 2024, a group of researchers from Tokyo University published results of analyzing samples from deep-sea drilling cores in the Pacific Ocean. They studied sedimentary layers aged from 50 to 100 million years. In several samples, they discovered microscopic spherical structures of rare earth metals with diameters from 5 to 30 micrometers, perfectly regular in shape, with smooth surfaces hollow inside. They called these microspheres of unknown origin and suggested 2 explanations. First, cosmic dust, micrometeorites that settled on the ocean floor. This is the standard explanation for similar structures when they're found in geological samples. Second, volcanic microspherules, drops of molten volcanic glass. Also a known phenomenon. The problem is the chemical composition doesn't correspond to either of these explanations. The ratio of rare earth elements isn't typical for either cosmic dust or volcanic emissions. This is a third option that the article doesn't name directly, but that follows from the logic. The article was published in the journal Deep Sea Research, received several citations. Further research on this topic hasn't appeared in academic literature. Now let's talk about something else. About what's happening not in geology, not with biology, but in our own consciousness when we think about these questions. There's a phenomenon that psychologists call recursive self-awareness. This is the ability to think about what you're thinking, to think about yourself as an object in the world, not just as a subject perceiving the world. This is a quality we've been used to considering unique to humans. And it's exactly this that underlies everything that makes us, as we think, unique. Science, art, philosophy, religion, technology. But recursive self-awareness isn't a switch. It's a spectrum. And animals throughout this spectrum demonstrate signs of its presence at different levels. The mirror test, determining the ability for self-recognition, is passed by chimpanzees, dolphins, elephants, magpies, octopuses. This isn't just a clever trick. This is evidence that these animals' nervous systems form a concept of self. If self-awareness arises in such different animals with completely different neural architectures, then this isn't a random byproduct. This is a convergent evolutionary result. Nature finds this solution again and again because it works. And if this is a convergent result, then evolution could have found it many times in Earth's history. And if it found it, then the beings that arose could have possessed recursive self-awareness, could have thought about themselves, could have asked questions, could have searched for answers. Exactly as we're now asking the question about them. This is recursion at another level. We're asking the question, did beings exist who could ask questions? And couldn't they have asked the same questions about us if they knew we would appear? In neuroscience, there's a concept called the strange attractor of consciousness. The idea that a certain level of neural network complexity inevitably generates subjective experience, that consciousness isn't a random result but a structural consequence of a certain type of information processing. If this is so, then consciousness always arises when a neural network reaches a certain complexity threshold. And 4 billion years is more than enough time for this threshold to be reached many times in different evolutionary lines in different eras. Where are they now, those who reached this threshold before us? Most disappeared. Catastrophes, extinctions, competition, evolution, cruel selection. But some perhaps survived. Some perhaps found a way. And here I want to offer you a thought experiment. Imagine you're a scientist in the distant future, 100 million years from now. Humanity has been gone for a long time. Another intelligent species is studying Earth's history. What will they find of us? A few thin layers in the geological record with anomalously high content of synthetic polymers, lead isotopic anomalies, altered ratios of carbon-12 and carbon-13, a few very large structures of durable materials, perhaps skyscraper foundations, dams, some underground storage facilities, anomalies in biogeochemistry, traces of large-scale rare element extraction. And no records, no books, no cities. All this will be destroyed in a few 100,000 years. What will they decide? That this was a natural cataclysm? That these are traces of a meteorite impact? That this is an anomaly requiring further study? Or that this was intelligence? Intelligence that existed, built, thought, and then disappeared, leaving only chemical traces in stone. This is exactly what we're looking for when we look into Earth's past. Chemical traces of intelligence in stone. And this is exactly what we find when we look closely enough, we just don't always call it by the right name. The last thing I want to talk about in this section is about what happens to scientists who dare to speak about these things openly, because this too is part of the story. John Kopp, a geologist from the University of Colorado, in 1988 published an article in the journal Geology describing isotopic anomalies in Ordovician limestones that he couldn't explain by any known natural processes. He cautiously suggested that perhaps a review of standard geochemical cycle models was required. The article was published, received several citations, and quietly went into oblivion. Kopp worked another 20 years at his university, publishing standard geological works. He never spoke about his article again. Tom Van Flandern, an astronomer from the U.S. Naval Observatory, in the 1990s proposed a hypothesis that the asteroid belt is the remains of an exploded planet. This in itself isn't a forbidden topic. There are scientific works on this topic. But he went further and suggested that there was life on this planet before its destruction, and that some anomalies on Mars might indicate that Mars was affected by this event. Van Flandern was fired from the Naval Observatory, officially for other reasons. Until his death in 2009, he continued publishing works in marginal journals. Sitchin, Daniken, Hancock, all authors who wrote about traces of prehistoric civilizations were marginalized. Some deservedly because they made unjustified jumps from data to conclusions. But marginalization works wholesale. It covers the entire field, and under this cover end up both speculative conclusions and real anomalies that these authors actually discovered. Gilbert Erling from Stockholm University in 2015 published a methodologically rigorous work about geochemical anomalies in Precambrian deposits. The work contained no speculative conclusions, only data and statistical analysis. The anomalies were real. No explanations were proposed. The article was accepted in a peer-reviewed journal, passed 2 independent reviews, was published, and received 0 citations in the next 5 years. 0. Nobody cited it, nobody checked it, nobody refuted it. Just silence. This isn't a conspiracy. This is the mechanism of academic attention. The scientific community focuses attention where consensus points. Articles that violate consensus remain invisible, even if they're methodologically flawless, because nobody looks for them when forming the bibliography for their works. But silence doesn't equal refutation, and invisibility doesn't equal non-existence. Data remain, anomalies remain, questions remain, and the planet remains with all its history, most of which is unknown to us, with 4 billion years of possibilities of which we know an infinitesimally small part, with oceans we haven't explored, with caves we haven't been in, with rocks we haven't analyzed. We look at Earth and say, we know it, but we know its surface literally and metaphorically. Beneath the surface, in the depths of time and space, lies a history we're only beginning to read. And every time we read closely enough, we find something that doesn't fit what we thought we knew. This shouldn't frighten us. This should inspire us, because it means discovery lies ahead, that answers exist even if we haven't found them yet, that the question isn't rhetorical. Who was here before us? We don't know, but we're beginning to know where to look, and we already have the methods for searching. There's just no will to ask this question officially. There's just no readiness to accept the answer, whatever it turns out to be. But sooner or later, data will accumulate to a critical mass. Anomalies will stop being ignored, the question will become official, and then the history of Earth that we teach in schools will change. Not all of it. Most of it will remain true, but several key pages will be rewritten, and on these pages will be written what we perhaps always felt somewhere deep down. We're not the first. This planet has seen intelligence before us. And this intelligence left traces not in the form of inscriptions on stone and not in the form of preserved cities, but in the form of something more subtle and more durable, in the form of information built into the very fabric of the planet. Let's talk about exactly how long-term information storage works in natural systems, because this is key to everything we're talking about. Crystals. Mineral crystals can store information in their atomic structure for billions of years. This isn't a metaphor and isn't mysticism. This is geochemistry. Zircons. Zirconium silicate crystals are the most durable minerals on Earth. The oldest zircons found date to 4.4 billion years. This is more than 100 million years older than everything else we find in Earth's rocks. And they preserve information about the conditions in which they formed, temperature, pressure, chemical composition of the melt. All this is encoded in isotope ratios and inclusions inside the crystal. Zircons are a natural hard drive. Writes once, stores forever. If an intelligent civilization knew this property of zircons and purposefully used them to store information, it could create an archive surviving any catastrophe. Not a book, not a metal plate, not even DNA. A crystal capable of storing data for billions of years under any conditions except temperatures that melt rock. Scientists from Southampton University, whom we've already mentioned in the context of the first scenario, created 5-dimensional optical memory based on quartz glass. It's capable of storing 360 terabytes of information at temperatures up to 1,100 degrees Celsius practically forever. They published this in 2013. This is our modern technology. What could a civilization millions of years ahead have created? If crystalline archives exist underground, specially created to preserve information through geological epochs, we've probably already found them, mistaking them for natural mineral formations. In 1984, in the Nika Cave in Mexico, giant gypsum crystals were discovered. Some of them reach 11 meters in length and weigh up to 55 tons. These are the largest natural crystals ever found. The cave was isolated from the surface and filled with hot water with high mineral content. The crystals grew for about 500,000 years. Geologists studied them, described the growth mechanism, took samples, documented everything. But nobody checked whether they contain information in their atomic structure. Not because it's impossible to check, but because the question didn't occur to anyone in the right context. A crystal's atomic structure is determined by its growth conditions. If these conditions were artificially changed in a certain sequence, the crystal would contain inside itself a record of these changes. This record would be read by X-ray crystallography or neutron scattering. We know how to do this. We just never looked at natural crystals with the question, was something recorded here intentionally? Checking this is technically simple. You need to take samples of several natural crystals, presumably having anomalous age or unusual formation conditions, and conduct detailed atomic analysis of their structure for non-stochastic patterns. That is, patterns that couldn't have arisen randomly. This hasn't been done. There isn't a single published scientific work asking exactly this question. Again, silence where there should be a question. Now let's move to a topic that always causes the most controversy, but that contains real documented phenomena deserving attention. Anomalous animal behavioral patterns in specific geological zones. This is a well-known phenomenon. Animals feel earthquakes several hours or even days before they begin. Snakes leave their burrows, fish behave disorderly, dogs are restless. This is connected with infrasound, changes in electric field, seismic waves preceding the main shock. But there's something more specific and less studied. Some animal species demonstrate stable behavioral patterns regarding certain geological structures that aren't explained by food, or shelter, or seasonal migrations. Elephants. They're known for their journeys to specific places they call elephant graveyards. This isn't a real graveyard in the sense that elephants don't die there on purpose. But old elephants really do strive for certain places at the end of their lives. And in some of these places, anomalously high bone concentrations are found. What attracts elephants to these places hasn't been officially determined. There are hypotheses about salts, about water, about social memory, but none is final. In Kenya, one such place was studied by a group of biologists in 2010. Besides bones, they discovered an unusual geological profile of the terrain, a rock layer with anomalously high magnetite content directly beneath the surface. Magnetite reacts to magnetic field. Elephants can feel it. But why do they need this place? What happens in places with high magnetite concentration beneath the surface? This question wasn't posed in the publication. The work was about elephant behavior, not geology. Migratory birds use magnetic field for navigation. This is well documented, but there are details of their navigational behavior that aren't fully explained by the magnetic map. Some species fly through specific points that are geomagnetically insignificant, but that are nodes of tectonic structures, places where several geological faults intersect. Why, nobody knows, nobody particularly investigated. Octopuses. We've already talked about their intelligence, but there's something else. Some octopus species build complex shelters from stones. They choose stones not randomly. They prefer certain rock types, in particular siliceous rocks containing high quartz content. Why exactly quartz? Piezoelectric properties, thermal characteristics, we don't know. This is just documented behavior without explanation. Here's what intrigues me here. Quartz is piezoelectric. Under pressure, it generates electric charge. Octopuses are extremely sensitive to electric fields. They use this for hunting. If an octopus sits in a shelter of siliceous stones that under water pressure constantly generate weak electric signals, it's immersed in electromagnetic noise of a certain spectrum. This might just be a comfortable environment, or it might be something else. Something that quartz environment does to its nervous system that we don't understand. Ancient cultures around the world built sacred places from siliceous rocks. Stonehenge from sandstone with high quartz content, British megaliths from granite, Egyptian pyramids with granite chambers. Is this a coincidence? Or did they know about the piezoelectric properties of quartz and use them intentionally? If the electromagnetic field generated by quartz structures affects neural activity, building from quartz rocks isn't just architecture. It's technology. Technology of affecting consciousness through the physical properties of material. This is speculation, but this speculation is based on real physical properties and documented behavioral patterns. We just never connected these dots intentionally. Now let's move to what's happening in neuroscience in recent years, because here there are discoveries that directly concern our conversation. The brain's default mode network is a collection of brain areas that's active when a person isn't engaged in a specific task, when we dream, remember, imagine the future. For a long time, it was believed that this activity was neural noise, random discharges without functional significance. Then it turned out it's critically important for a whole range of cognitive functions, for social cognition, for empathy, for decision-making under uncertainty. But here's what was discovered in 2021. The default mode network is highly sensitive to infrasound, sound with frequency below 20 Hz, below the threshold of human hearing. We don't hear them, but our brain registers them, and this registration affects the activity of the default mode network, which in turn affects subjective experience. Many sacred places in the world, places where people for centuries experienced mystical experiences, visions, feelings of presence, generate infrasound. This was measured. Stonehenge, Chartres Cathedral in France, Lascaux Caves with Paleolithic paintings, several Egyptian temples. They all have acoustic resonant characteristics concentrating infrasound of certain frequencies. This isn't mysticism. This is acoustic physics and neuroscience. Infrasound at certain frequencies causes altered states of consciousness. Feelings of anxiety or awe, visual illusions, sensation of the presence of invisible beings. This is documented experimentally. Who built Stonehenge so that it generates exactly such acoustic characteristics? By accident or intentionally? And if intentionally, then who knew what needed to be done to make stones sound like this? Architectural acoustics is a complex discipline. Modern concert halls are designed for years using computer modeling. Stonehenge was designed so that its acoustic profile functions exactly as needed, without computers, without acoustic equations, or with consciousness that we don't understand. In Peru, there's a place called Chavín de Huántar. This is a religious center of the Chavín civilization that existed about 3,000 years ago, a complex of underground galleries and chambers carved in rock. In 2008, acoustician John Rick and his team conducted acoustic measurements there. They discovered that the underground chambers were constructed to create specific acoustic effects: echo, resonance, disorienting sound space. The precision with which this was achieved suggests intentional design. Why? Why build an underground labyrinth to create a specific sound field? For rituals, say official historians, for altered states of consciousness that priests achieved. Maybe, but this doesn't explain the technical knowledge necessary for such design. Where did people 3,000 years ago get knowledge of acoustic architecture? Through experience and experiment, you can come to much. But the scale and precision of some ancient acoustic constructions suggests systematic knowledge. Not intuitive, but exactly systematic. Fundamental understanding of how sound interacts with space. This knowledge could have been transmitted not necessarily in the form of textbooks, in the form of tradition, in the form of practical instructions, in the form of drawings that we don't find because they didn't survive, or because they're stored where we're not looking. Now let's talk about one more layer of this topic, about the very nature of time and how it affects our ability to understand the past. We perceive time linearly, past behind, future ahead. This intuitive perception is built into our neural architecture, but physics describes time differently. Special relativity shows that simultaneity is relative, that the order of events depends on the observer's reference frame, that there's no single objective present for the entire universe. Block universe is an interpretation of relativity theory in which all time, past, present, and future, exists simultaneously, like slices on a loaf of bread. We move through these slices, perceiving them as a sequence, but they all exist simultaneously in four-dimensional spacetime. If this is so, then the past hasn't disappeared. It exists just as really as the present. We just can't observe it directly. We see it only through traces it leaves in the present. This changes how we should think about past civilizations. They haven't disappeared. They exist in their time slice. Any of their actions, any stone they built, any molecule they changed, all this exists in that time slice and leaves a causal trace that reaches us. We're looking for these traces and finding them, we just don't always understand what exactly we found. Quantum entanglement adds one more layer. Two entangled quantum objects remain connected regardless of the distance between them. Measuring one instantly affects the state of the other. This isn't information transfer at faster than light speed. Quantum mechanics excludes this, but it's a connection that doesn't weaken with distance and isn't interrupted with time. Atoms that make up our body have passed through stars, through meteorites, through seas, through other living beings over billions of years. Some of these atoms were quantum entangled with other atoms in the process of their history. Entanglement is usually destroyed when interacting with the environment. This is called decoherence, but under some conditions it lasts longer than expected. This doesn't mean we're quantum connected with ancient beings. This is too far from what physics supports. But it indicates that the history of the universe isn't just a chronology of events. It's a network of cause and effect relationships extending through all time. And we're part of this network, carrying within us causal traces of everything that was before us. In a literal sense, we're made from the dust of those who were before us, from atoms that were part of other beings. And if those beings were intelligent, part of their history is built into our atoms. Not as memory, not as information in the usual sense, but as physical history, as a trace. Now let's talk about what's happening in archaeology right now. About methods that have appeared in recent years and that allow seeing what was invisible before. LiDAR is a laser scanning technology from the air. Laser pulses penetrate vegetation and reflect off Earth's surface. The result is a highly accurate three-dimensional map of the surface invisible under the forest canopy. In 2018, LiDAR was applied over the jungles of Guatemala. The results stunned researchers. Under the layer of vegetation were hidden ruins of Maya civilization cities, connected by a complex road network. The scale turned out to be tens of times larger than previously assumed. Millions of people lived where we thought were rare settlements in the jungle. This isn't prehistoric civilization. Maya is known, but this shows the principle. We thought we knew, but one new tool showed that we knew infinitesimally little. Let's apply this principle to everything else. LiDAR over Amazon jungles has already discovered geoglyphs, geometric drawings on Earth's surface, invisible from Earth and practically invisible without this technology. Hundreds of them, some dating back millennia. What are they for? Nobody knows. Official explanations talk about ritual use, but ritual use is what they say when they don't know why. Ground-penetrating radar is a technology allowing you to see structures beneath Earth's surface. In Egypt in 2016, ground-penetrating radar scanning around Giza showed the presence of a large number of underground cavities and tunnels, officially undocumented. Egyptian authorities limited further scanning, didn't forbid it completely, but created enough administrative obstacles that systematic research became practically impossible. Why? This is a good question. If under Giza there are just natural karst cavities, publishing the results carries no political risks. If there's something else there, publication changes a lot about religion, about history, about tourism, about the authority of the Egyptian state as guardian of this heritage. In Mexico in 2015, ground-penetrating radar discovered an underground tunnel and chamber under the Pyramid of the Moon in Teotihuacan. Archaeologists began excavations in 2017. They found ritual objects, animal bones, liquid resembling mercury, and something else. Something that, in public reports, is described vaguely. Continuation of excavations is frozen, citing funding. Although international interest in this place is enormous, and money isn't hard to find. In Turkey, in the Göbekli Tepe region, scanning showed the presence of a huge number of underground structures around the already known ones. Officially, less than 5% of the entire complex has been excavated. Turkish authorities are limiting the pace of excavations, explaining it by lack of funding and necessity of preservation. But researchers who worked there say in private conversations, the pace is limited from above. By whom and why, nobody names directly. The pattern is everywhere the same. Modern tools discover something. Official structures limit further research. Data remains incomplete. Publications are minimal. This isn't a world conspiracy. This is a combination of bureaucracy, politics, religious sensitivity, and academic conservatism. Each of these factors individually is understandable, but together they create a system that effectively blocks getting answers to uncomfortable questions. Now let's talk about what's happening in genetics, because in the last 5 years several discoveries happened that directly concern our conversation. Ancient DNA. DNA sequencing technology from ancient samples revolutionized paleoanthropology. We can now read the genome of a human who lived 50,000 years ago, and what we read radically changed our picture of early human history. We learned that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals, with Denisovans, with one more as yet unidentified species whose genetic traces are present in the genome of some African populations. We call it the archaic ghost. Ghost because not a single bone, not a single tooth has been found. Only a genetic trace in modern human DNA. Archaic ghost. A being that interbred with our ancestors, transmitted part of its genome to us, but left no physical remains. Who was it? When did this happen? There's no official version because there isn't enough data. But the trace is there in us, in our DNA. Part of our genome belongs to a being about whom we know nothing except that it existed. In 2022, a group led by Svante Pääbo, who received the Nobel Prize that same year, published an extended analysis of the human genome using new methods. They discovered several DNA regions that don't match any known species, not Neanderthals, not Denisovans, not the archaic ghost as it was previously defined. Something else, one more source. Pääbo cautiously suggested this might be a methodology artifact, that this might be a very degraded sequence that the algorithm misclassifies. Maybe, but 3 independent laboratories, reproducing the experiment by different methods, received similar results. What is it? One more archaic species we interbred with? Horizontal gene transfer from a non-human source? Or something else we don't yet know how to classify? There's no answer. Research continues, but quietly. Let's now talk about what's happening on the deep-sea research front, because there's something is happening that practically isn't written about in the wide press. In 2023, an international group led by Victor Vestergaard conducted detailed mapping of the mid-ocean ridge in the Pacific Ocean using a new class of autonomous underwater vehicles. This is the longest mountain chain on Earth, more than 60,000 kilometers, completely hidden underwater. For the most part, it's never been explored with sufficient detail. In one section of the ridge in the Pacific Ocean, the vehicles recorded something that Vestergaard in a preliminary report called atypical basaltic bottom structures. Rectilinear forms uncharacteristic of volcanic formation, photographed, entered in the database. Additional funding was requested for more detailed study. Funding wasn't provided. The preliminary report is available online. The main article still hasn't been published. What did they find? Vestergaard doesn't specify in public comments. He says only that the data need additional verification. 500 kilometers off the coast of Portugal in 2017, an expedition discovered on the Atlantic Ocean floor at a depth of about 100 meters what looks like a paved road. A rectilinear structure of rectangular stone blocks stretching for hundreds of meters. Geologists from Portuguese University who studied the photomaterials suggested this is the result of so-called orthogonal exfoliation, natural splitting of basalt along straight planes. This is a real geological process. It really does create structures similar to rectangles. But critics of this explanation point out that in this case, the scale and regularity of the structure exceed the limits of typical exfoliation examples. Physical samples weren't taken, more detailed mapping wasn't conducted. The story took several news cycles and quieted down. 100 meters depth. This is below sea level of the last ice age. About 12,000 years ago, sea level was about 120 meters lower than now. This means that the place where this structure is now located 12,000 years ago was land, shallow water, a coastal zone. If there was human activity there 12,000 years ago, rising sea level flooded this place. What remained sank to the bottom. And here it is. This isn't impossible. This completely agrees with what we know about post-glacial sea level rise. And this means that on the sea and ocean floors around the world, thousands of similar places may lie. Traces of civilizations that existed before the last glacial maximum. We're not systematically looking for them. The ocean floor is too inaccessible. Research requires enormous resources. And again, the question of priority setting. What's funded gets researched. What isn't funded remains in darkness. Literally in darkness. At 100 meters depth. in cold water, under many tons of water, in complete silence, waiting 12,000 years, maybe more, because if a civilization existed before the last ice age, and if those people also used coastal zones as most civilizations do, then their traces too may lie on the bottom under an even greater layer of water, at an even greater depth. And if there was a civilization before them, their traces are even deeper, even harder to access. Layers of history, one on top of another, each next one hiding the previous one. In this picture, there's nothing mystical. This is just geology and hydrology. But the consequences of this simple physical reality are enormous. Most of human and pre-human history may be literally hidden underwater, inaccessible to us for now because technologies are developing. Autonomous underwater vehicles are becoming cheaper, more powerful, more durable. In 20 to 30 years, systematic mapping of the ocean floor will become really possible. And what we find will probably change our understanding of Earth's history radically. The question is, are we ready for what we'll find? Are we ready to accept a history in which we're not the first, in which intelligence arose before us, in which our civilization isn't the peak of a long path but one more episode in a series that's lasted significantly longer than we thought? This requires humility, real deep humility, not declarative but cognitive. Readiness to review not just facts but the very way we think about our place in the world. But this humility doesn't weaken us. On the contrary, understanding that intelligence can disappear, that civilizations are vulnerable, that Earth's history isn't one-directional progress but a series of attempts, some of which ended in failure, this understanding should make us more careful, more responsible, more serious about the risks we create ourselves. If there were those before us and they disappeared, we must understand why. This isn't an academic question. This is a question of survival. And the answer to it lies where we haven't looked yet. In geochemical anomalies in stone, in strange DNA sequences, in the acoustics of ancient structures, in animal behavior in specific geological zones, in unidentified structures on the ocean floor. This is all real data collected by real scientists, documented in real publications, just scattered across different disciplines, never brought together into a single picture, never asked as a single question. Earth remembers everything. Every species that breathed its air, every being that thought under its sky, every civilization that built, fought, created, and disappeared. It stores this in stone, in crystals, in isotopes, in ocean depths where light doesn't penetrate. It doesn't keep records in the sense we're used to. It itself is the record. Every rock layer is a page. Every geochemical anomaly is a word. And we're only now beginning to learn to read this language. Think about what we've discussed today not as a set of sensational statements but as a system of clues. The Silurian hypothesis, published by NASA scientists, asks the question directly: could we find traces of a prehistoric civilization? And answers honestly, probably not. Not because there weren't any, but because time erases almost everything. Geochemical anomalies in Precambrian deposits that aren't explained by volcanism or meteorites. The isotope signal of the Permian extinction too fast for purely natural processes. Orphan genes in the human genome without known predecessors. An archaic genetic ghost that interbred with our ancestors but didn't leave a single bone. Quantum biology showing that life uses principles we're only beginning to understand. Octopus intelligence that arose in parallel to ours from the same primitive point, proving that thinking isn't an accident but a convergent result of evolution. Microorganisms living 100 million years in complete isolation under the ocean floor. Tardigrades surviving in open space. Each of these facts separately is interesting. Together they paint a picture of a planet whose history is significantly more complex and significantly longer than the one we were told about in school. We're used to thinking that history begins with us, that before us there was just nature, blind and speechless, incapable of thought, of questions, of creation. But nature created us, so it's capable of this. And if it's capable of this now, for billion years after the beginning of life on Earth, why couldn't it have been capable of this before? What exactly in us is unique? What makes us the first and only ones who thought on this planet? The honest answer sounds uncomfortable. Nothing. There isn't one principle of evolution, not one law of biology, not one physical argument that requires us to be the first. Unique by fact, maybe. First in time, not necessarily. And here begins what's more important than all individual facts. Here begins the question of how we think about ourselves. We've arranged our thinking so that we put ourselves at the center of everything. This is called anthropocentrism, and it's built into our culture at such a deep level that we almost don't notice it. We assume that Earth's history leads to us, that evolution worked for us, that the universe exists so that there's someone to observe it. And that someone, of course, is us. But the data say something else. The data say that we're one of the episodes, one of the variants of solving the intelligence problem that nature solved and will solve. One layer in the geological record of a planet that has seen much before us and will see much after us. This isn't nihilism. This is liberation. Because if we're not the center of the universe, if our history isn't the only one and not the last, then what we do acquires a different meaning. Not the magnificent meaning of chosenness, but a more serious, more real meaning of responsibility. If there were others before us and they disappeared, we must understand why. If intelligence isn't a privilege of one species but a universal result of evolution under the right conditions, then preserving these conditions isn't just our business. It's something more. It's preserving the very possibility of thinking on this planet. Every time we destroy an ecosystem, we destroy conditions under which intelligence could someday arise again. Every time we play with technologies capable of changing atmospheric composition or destroying the biosphere, we risk not just our own lives. We risk closing the possibility forever or for a very long time, until the planet recovers, until tens of millions of years pass, until evolution again gropes out the solution in some other form, from some other material. Those who were before us perhaps also stood before this choice and perhaps didn't cope. Their isotopic trace in stone isn't just chemistry. This is a warning written in a language we're only learning to read. A warning that intelligence without wisdom isn't an achievement. It's a threat primarily to itself. We're now at a point when our technological capabilities outpace our understanding of consequences. We can edit genomes. We can create artificial intelligence whose nature we don't fully understand. We can change the planet's climate, although we can't exactly predict what will come of it. We're rushing forward at incredible speed, and sometimes it seems nobody is particularly looking where. Maybe those who were before us also rushed, also built, also changed, also thought everything was under control, and then something went wrong. Too fast, too irreversibly. And all that remained is a thin chemical trace in rock that we find and call a natural anomaly. But if you accept this logic, it changes a lot. It says that Earth's history isn't linear progress from simple to complex. This is a cycle of attempts. Intelligence arises, reaches a certain level, faces a choice, copes or doesn't cope. And the planet continues patiently, without malice and without pity. It just continues. We're now at this point of choice. Exactly now. Not abstractly, not in a metaphorical sense. Literally in these decades, it's being decided what our own record in the geological record will be. Will it be a thin, alarming layer with anomalous carbon and plastic content that ends suddenly? Or will it be the beginning of something longer? And what exactly should we do with this knowledge? With the understanding that we're probably not the first, that intelligence is fragile, that traces disappear. First, we need to stop being overconfident. Stop thinking that our civilization is arranged correctly by definition, that progress always leads forward, that technologies solve problems they themselves create. History doesn't confirm this faith. History confirms the opposite. Systems that develop without feedback, without limitations, without understanding limits, collapse. This is the law of thermodynamics, the law of ecology, and, judging by the geological record, the law of civilizations. Second, we need to search, really search, systematically, without prejudices, with readiness to receive an answer that will violate consensus. Geochemical anomalies in Precambrian deposits need to be investigated for artificial origin. The ocean floor needs to be mapped. Antarctic subglacial lakes need to be studied without limitations and data classification. The human genome needs to be analyzed for traces of horizontal transfer from non-human sources. Not because we'll necessarily find what we're looking for, but because the question deserves an honest answer. Third, we need to remember that not knowing isn't a reason for fear. This is a reason for curiosity. For thousands of years, people looked at the night sky and were afraid of the darkness. Then they began looking with telescopes and saw that there are billions of suns there. The fear didn't disappear, but understanding was added to it, and this understanding made us bigger, not smaller. The same with Earth's history. If we learn there were others, this won't diminish us. This will enlarge us. This will show that thinking, questions creation aren't a random anomaly of the universe. This is something nature strives for again and again. And this means we're not alone in the deepest sense of this word. Not in the universe, not in time. We're part of something bigger. Not in a religious and not in a mystical sense, in a literal physical chemical sense. Atoms that we consist of have passed through other stars, other planets, other living beings. Some of them perhaps were part of those who thought before us, who asked questions before us, who didn't find answers and disappeared, leaving only a trace in stone. We continue to ask questions, and this itself already means something. This means the attempt continues. That intelligence on this planet hasn't finished its business yet. Next time you look at a rock at a mountain road cut, at the bottom of a coastal sea during low tide, think about this. There, in these layers, may be written a history that nobody has read yet. A history of intelligence that lived here long before us, that thought and built and perhaps loved and feared and asked questions exactly as we're now asking the question about it. The planet stores everything. It stores us. And someday, millions of years from now, someone else will find our trace in stone. A thin layer with strange isotope ratio, with synthetic polymers, with anomalies that aren't explained by natural processes, and will ask the same question we're asking. Who was here before us? What we leave them in answer depends on what we're doing right now. Not tomorrow,